Opinion, you might say. Thank you very much for that overview. And we are just 2.5 hours away now from vote counting in India's sprawling elections. And I'm pleased to say our own Tanvir Gill joins us live from New Delhi. And Tanvir, sprawling might be an understatement even in this case, considering it is the world's largest democratic exercise. And you've been looking at the numbers of what we already know in terms of who exactly turned out. What can you tell us?
Well, Nancy, firstly, namaste to you, namaste to Shri, namaste to all our viewers from the heart of India, from the capital city of New Delhi. And like you said, the D-Day is here. It's counting day to the mammoth Indian election result. And I just want to break down the process into numbers. This election process has taken 6 weeks to cover 7 phases to essentially go across the board, the length and breadth of India, covering 29 states and 7 union territories with 900 million eligible voters and a 67% voter turnout, essentially meaning that 600 million people have exercised their right to choose the next government. 48% of them are women, which is essentially 280 million, 84 million first-time voters. And if you do a dipstick survey, people will tell you that this election is largely about those two categories. The influencers are really the women voters as well as the first-time voters. 7 national parties, 36 state-recognized parties, 329 regional parties, and more than 2,000 unrecognized parties are fighting for what? And I want to remind this to our viewers again and again. It's really 543 seats up for grabs in the lower house of parliament, with 272 being the midpoint to claim majority and form the next government. Uttar Pradesh will be the key battleground. It's the largest state in India by population and contributes 80 seats to the center. So it really boils down to the numbers, and the headline fight is between 2 top contenders, that is Prime Minister Narendra Modi as well as the leader of the opposition, Rahul Gandhi. We have a whole day to go. I'm getting goosebumps. The energy is palpable here. Bit of nervous energy in the air, so let's see what happens.
I had goosebumps as well 5 years ago when I was covering this election, Tanvir, and it was really interesting because I saw a story in one of the papers that the party faithful at the BJP in Delhi were so convinced that Modi ji would get a super majority that they were cooking 300 laddus. 300 laddus, that they would blast past the majority and get a super majority. It's going to be so much more challenging this time round. 272 is the magic number, right?
Oh, absolutely. And, there has been a party, well, a bit of celebration that's already happened within the BJP. Like I said, the exit polls have indicated it's a foregone conclusion that the BJP-led India Alliance will come back. I just want to, highlight, some factors which are being discussed, which are pretty much in the realms of speculation. I want to run this as a caveat for our viewers. There's no concrete evidence to suggest that that's the thinking on the ground, but just something that I picked up from WhatsApp groups and gossip circles and chatter on the street. So yes, 272 is the magic number. That's a simple majority, and there's no taking away from that. But there's also talk about another important number, which is 360, which is 2/3 majority, an absolute sweeping majority in the lower house of parliament. And the number is really coming up because exit polls are indicating that the BJP-led NDA alliance will be able to retain its seat share in parliament just like they did in 2014, or perhaps can better it. Early indications suggest that right now the number to go by with is 300, but 360 is important because you need 2/3 majority in the lower house as well as the upper house to clear some key social reforms through constitutional amendments. So economic reforms will come through if you go past 270, and that should not be an issue. But really, to bring about those path-breaking social reforms through constitutional amendments requires 2/3 majority in the lower house and the upper house. And for the upper house, which is the Rajya Sabha, the expectation is by 2020, the BJP will have dominance in Rajya Sabha as well. So that will just help, ease the process of really clearing the reforms that have been long pending, guys.
And Tanvir, you've spoken about the fact that these exit polls, though, don't necessarily have the best track record. And I wonder, given the run-up we saw in Indian equities and for the currency as well after those exit polls hit, if investors need to be a bit careful here and not set themselves up for disappointment if the majority doesn't turn out in the way that they currently predict.
I'm glad you brought that point up, Nancy, because we need to put this in context of what the markets are reading into in terms of what the exit polls are reflecting and what the actual numbers will look like. So year to date, the markets have returned about 8 to 9%. 4% of that has come in, 4 to 5% of that has come in the last 4 sessions. We've seen flows from FIIs to the tune of 9-10 billion so far into the year. Again, in the run-up to the election results, there was some sort of a pullback, some sort of profit-taking that happened, but the last 2 days have been key contributors to the overall participation that we've seen from the foreign desk in India. But I think what's very critical, and I want to highlight this, is going forward, foreign investors will be watching out for the growth numbers. Remember, we have the Q4 GDP numbers coming out for FY19, the financial year gone by. End of May, once the government comes to power, the new government comes to power, and those numbers may show a marked slowdown to growth between 6 and 6.5%. So I think that's something that will weigh on sentiment. And given where valuations are, Nancy, any sort of mild disappointment will also be seen as reason to book some profits in the market. So I think we are priced to perfection right now in India. Unless there's a 300-seat majority that hits the screen, there could be some reason for a pullback from here.
All right, we'll certainly watch that after those results are confirmed. Tanvir, great to have you there on the ground. Thank you so much for joining us. Well, let's bring in our guest host this hour. Steve Bryce is Chief Investment Strategist at Standard Chartered Private Bank. Steve, great to have you on the show today. Certainly no shortage of news to get your views on this morning.
What's going on?
Well, why don't we start with India? I mean, do you have a view on the market as we await the official count on this election?
So obviously the initial market reaction has been fairly positive. I mean, the market up over 5% over the past week. Currency actually fairly range-bound, but against the backdrop of a moderately stronger dollar. Overall, I think the environment's pretty positive. So I don't think it was too unexpected, that we get a positive outcome from the election. Obviously, we haven't got the outcome yet, but our sense is, though, that, I mean, price to perfection is a bit strong for us, but we do feel that India is unlikely to outperform Asia ex Japan. Well, I mean, if you look at valuations, yes, clearly they're not cheap, but they haven't been cheap for a long time. If you look at the underlying fundamentals of the economy, I think, India's doing reasonably well. Obviously, the reform agenda has been, going ahead reasonably well as well. So overall, I think, the environment's quite positive. But as I say, we still feel there's other places in the world that are probably better investments at this stage. We're seeing fund managers actually starting to unwind their long-held overweight of Indian assets, so that suggests that outperformance, at least in the short term, is going to be problematic.
Okay.
Steve, you say investors are likely to price in growth, recovery and continued pro-business reforms if official results on the 23rd of May, which is today, confirm that the BJP-led NDA coalition achieves a majority. What makes you so sure, though, that Modi will get the reform programme right when he messed it up in his first term, arguably, with demonetisation? And as a result of that, India got re-rated by the market.
Yeah, I think obviously the demonetisation is raises a lot of questions in people's minds as to was it a good thing, was it a bad thing? I think our sense is that it probably wasn't as damaging as many people expected it to be. But I think overall, in terms of the direction of reform that the Indian authorities are going to take, are going to be positive for growth over the long term. I mean, you've still got the underlying fundamentally very strong factors, of course, that the demographic profile for India is very positive. So, as long as you can create jobs for people, that will take care of top-line growth, if you like. So, whereas in much of the world we're seeing ageing populations, that's clearly not the case in India and Africa. So from that perspective, we still think it's a pretty good long-term story.
What about the short-term challenges, especially from the rising oil price? And especially given the balance of risks on the geopolitical side in the Middle East, if we see $75, $80, $85 a barrel in short order, then that's going to have some pretty severe implications on the fiscal side for India.
Yeah, no, clearly that would be a challenge. I mean, we obviously have seen over the past 6 months, oil prices have already gone up very sharply, and India's done, okay during that period. But the higher they go, the more problematic it does get for them. The key concern there is that demand is obviously still growing for oil. From a supply perspective, I think that's where the majority of the concerns come through, obviously in terms of Iran, but you also got Libya and Venezuela, so you've got a lot of potential supply shocks out there. Markets are obviously pricing that in partially, but if one of them were to hit fully, that would probably push the oil price higher from here.
Steve, what about the issue of currency vulnerability? I mean, not just for India, but other current account deficit countries that have faced this problem already before. It does seem as though we're hearing almost a growing chorus of people who predict that dollar strength could stay, especially if we continue to see a deterioration in risk sentiment.
Yeah, I think our sense is that in the very short term, so over the next few weeks, we're probably going to see continued volatility in markets that could put continued upward pressure on the dollar, and as to your point, downward pressure on other currencies, including emerging market currencies and ones with significant current account deficits. Longer term, we don't think this is going to sustain. So we are starting to see signs of a growth recovery coming through. So yes, if you look at manufacturing data in the US, for instance, it looks pretty poor. But you are seeing growth expectations in the US, not just because of the upward revision to Q1, but also Q2, Q3, Q4 growth expectations starting to be revised higher. The same for China, obviously before the trade tensions. I'm sure we'll talk about that later. They're coming through as well. So our sense is that growth is going to continue and probably accelerate in the second half of this year. Okay. That should be put positive risk appetite and probably ultimately negative for the dollar as well.
Steve, thank you for that. I really fancy a laddu or two at this time in the morning, washed down with a nice masala chai. You know what a laddu is, right?
Yeah, but I've never had one.
It's a very sweet Indian dessert.
So similar
like a little
to sugar wrapped around, like on the
very
outside?
Sugary,
okay.
Very unhealthy, to be taken in moderation. But 5 years ago, the election was fantastic when Modi blasted past the majority, simple majority, super majority. There was a big party outside BJP headquarters. There literally were elephants painted with the slogans and kids shoving laddus and cups of tea into your hand. And it was, a wonderful exercise in Indian democracy, but I wonder if it's going to be different, more challenging this time around.
It's a reminder of democracy at work, I suppose. So do you have it with coffee? That's what I want to know.
Washed down with a masala chai. That's what you want to do.
That sounds lovely, actually.
Then you've got to go for a workout afterwards, because it is very fattening. Right, Steve Bryce stays with us. We'll talk trade next, of course, and the impact on US consumers as Washington sets out a timeline for when it could impose the next round of tariffs on Beijing. We'll be right back.
I'd like to donate these books.
Thank you very much.
Where do you get that book?
A man donated it.
Yes? I'm sorry, but I need to retrieve
I believe you're looking for this.
No. Thank you so much.
Return the book.
Sir!
One key thing which differentiated us, especially in the early days, was just focus. So when we started Flipkart, we were only focusing on books. There were probably 10, 15 other e-commerce companies trying to win in the market, but everybody else was was after short-term goals of